Let me begin with this.
Here today, Random and Reckless Entertainment does this for us, along with Brainstar Media. Today, I have a guest, Randy, that is special to me, a mentor of mine in many ways. Mr. David Hyde, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right.
Good, good. Thanks for coming. Thanks for sitting down with me. So, David's a sociology professor, badass activist, I would say. Would you call yourself an activist?
I think less every year. I use that term a lot less.
Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's getting older or something like that, but I think I'm more an academic than I used to be.
Right.
And it's not that I don't want to still, change the world and make everything better and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you get older and your perspective changes a little bit.
Right. Absolutely. So when we talk, let's just get a little bit of background on you real quick, because sure. I know you, like, for instance, I was a kid that got a chance to go to college late. Not a kid. I was a young adult. And I got hurt. My back got hurt, and I got a chance to go to school for a little while. And I showed up, and they said, you should take this sociology course. And I went, what's that? And I came. I have to tell you this because I still do it. Like, I've taught a couple times, and I kind of steal this from you.
Okay.
So when I walked into your class, and sociology changed my life. I went into anthropology, but sociology was just the bee's knees for a while for me. And it was because of you, and you walked in and you said something that I just thought was so cool. You said, if you pay attention and you work hard in this class, it'll be the best class you've ever taken. And I thought that wasn't cocky. It was just there and straight up. And you're right. I went to universities, master's program in Philly, and your classes have always been on my top stuff. Great stuff.
Well, that's good to hear. I mean, you set the expectations for folks, right? And that's,
right.
And that's what you get.
Mm-hmm.
So you tell people something's going to be good, and it's going to be good.
Mm-hmm. Really, really good. And what amazed me about your classes is that you didn't really apply to all these, bells and whistles and stuff like that. It was, you're lecture driven. And but you did seminars and stuff like that, but your lectures were always captivating, and you just use black and white screen.
Yeah.
I loved it,
Yeah, well, you don't want a bunch of stuff to distract.
Right. So is that intentional?
It is. Yeah. I mean, I just like everybody, I think
Mm-hmm.
I hate it when I see like a PowerPoint that's got all these transitions in it, and yeah.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that you never use like a chart or a graph or anything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if it's important,
Mm-hmm.
sure,
Mm-hmm.
do that. I think that I see the world, and I try and do that in class too. Most people get really affected by personal stories. Like, they hear about this one individual and it rips their heartstrings or whatever. And I have always seen the world kind of the opposite of that. Like, personal stories, I mean, I guess they matter, but like, I'm a statistics and data and that kind of person. And my wife says I'm rational to a fault. And
I've actually said that you're incredibly rational to people.
And I try and bring that into class. I try and get other people to see, like, if you think, that your aunt getting cancer is bad, wait till you hear about 200,000 ants.
Right. Right. Or when somebody says something in class and you go, well, let's think about that. I can always tell when you're about to rebut, to the contrary, and frame it in a different way. Before I want to get into your past a little bit and stuff like that. But before we do that, what was your favorite class to teach? I loved social movements. I loved that class.
Social movements is a fun class to teach.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a really hard class for me to teach because it's so constantly kind of changing and evolving, and I'm still trying to wrap my brain around how I want to approach that class.
Right.
So it's the most challenging class for me to teach, for sure.
Because it's moving.
It's moving.
Right? So you can't just get a set curriculum.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. And so, maybe that's a favorite. Sometimes I teach a class on globalization, and sometimes maybe that's a favorite.
Oh, I remember globalization. Love that one.
Yeah.
Love that one too.
That's the one that I have more background in. I mean,
it's where I learned about neoliberalism. And
right,
all that
right.
stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Good stuff.
It's funny. I think I have fallen subject, just like anybody, to too much time online and kind of the culture wars and comment sections and all that. And I was getting into it with somebody. This was a while back. I think it was over like the 2016 election or something like that, the primaries, right?
Right.
Some sort of like Sanders Clinton discussion with somebody or something like that. And I described Hillary Clinton as being a neoliberal. And somebody just jumped all over me. And they're like, people use that word and they don't even know what it means and all that. And I was like, but I wrote a book about it. You know, like, so I know what that word means.
I'll have you know.
Like, I mean, and I don't know how that works online, but I was like, but I'm using the word correctly.
Right.
You know,
right.
I'm not,
I kind of know.
I'm not using it hyperbolically. Like,
Right.
I mean, I really mean specifically neoliberal.
Right. That's absolutely hilarious. And it's we've got into that, right? It's just barking.
Yeah.
You know, I want to get your take on that. I have so much to talk to you about. I have a premonition that we're going to have him come back, Randy, because we're not going to be able to fit all this in an hour.
You think so?
I think so. I know so.
If he'll come back, it depends on how you treat him.
That's true.
That's true. That's true. So I'm going to try to be nice now, and then rope.
Because you know what they say:
in.
treat people how you want to be treated.
Never.
That's just don't be a Neo Eric.
Don't be a Neo.
Don't be a Neo Eric.
So let's go back. There was like, let's go back. Let's just talk about how you became like you started in Oklahoma. Go for it. I remember you hopped on a train, right? And you were
long before I hopped on a train. I was a kid in Oklahoma. I was a super nerdy, super picked on kid in Oklahoma, like physically picked on, nerdy kid, and all that. About ninth grade or something, two things kind of came into my life that opened up doors to me and kind of changed my world. One was that I joined the debate team. I didn't make the soccer team one year because I'm not much of an athlete.
Right.
So I joined the debate team, and that got me interested and hooked on politics and thinking about the world and reading a lot, and you know, gave me something to do on the weekends and all that. And about the same time, I got into punk rock music.
Right.
And the combination of those two things. I mean,
I was gonna say.
So right off the bat, I was a Dead Kennedys fan, and you know the things that you would sort of expect in that kind
we
of
had
context.
Blaine Cook from The Accused on the other day.
Oh, neat.
It was really cool. From the Farts, it was great. Yeah.
And so those things kind of opened up doors to me, and they showed me a part of the world that I hadn't really seen and all that. I knew I wanted to study something kind of political when I went to school. Started off as ended up at the University of Oklahoma. Of course, there's a story there, and there's I won't get into that one today, but I ended up running across the country with a girl I was dating and got chased by the FBI and all this.
I remember
kind of crazy
this.
stuff happened. It's on a different podcast. That's why I'm not going to get into it much today. Yeah, but anyway, so I ended up at the University of Oklahoma and studied political science there. You said that when you took my class, you didn't really know what sociology was.
Right.
I also didn't know what sociology was,
Okay.
right? And so I knew I wanted to do something kind of political and that I wanted to talk to people and I had strong opinions and I wanted to convince them of those strong opinions and all that. But I didn't know exactly how I wanted to do that. Right. And so undergrad, poli-sci, and then started grad school also in poli-sci and wasn't very happy with the program I was in there.
And that was at UW, right?
No, this was still at OU.
Oh, because you came out to your doctorate at UW.
That's a number of years later, right. But no, still there at OU, and had a friend in the sociology department, and they said, hey, why don't you? They heard that I was kind of complaining about the program I was in. I was a little unhappy with the political science, and I was also taking some law school classes there at the time. In fact, I had a class with Anita Hill.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's cool.
And right at kind of the peak of her like public, knownness, right?
She was teaching the class?
Yeah.
Wow, very cool.
Yeah.
And she was going through the whole Clarence Thomas thing?
She had just gone through it. This was shortly after. And so anyway, wasn't happy with really the law program or the political science program. Had a friend that was a grad student in sociology that said, hey, come check out our program. And I did, and loved it, and realized that I could kind of study and learn about and talk about the same stuff that I'd been interested in political science, the same issues, but a little different approach. I think it, I'm not going to go too far down an academic rabbit hole here, but I think that sociology starts earlier than political science. Like, it doesn't have as many assumptions to it.
Okay.
You kind of start with like, okay, there's people, and that's the whole assumption.
Right.
And then you go from there.
Yeah.
And so, and I like that approach.
Right.
And so, so I ended up studying sociology there, spent the next 2 years getting a master's there. And then, like any, relatively smart kid from the Midwest, I finished up and I headed to California. And
Yeah.
So I lived in San Francisco for a couple of years.
Awesome.
Decided to go back to grad school, and then I headed to Seattle, to UW, to work on a PhD. That's kind of how I ended up here in the Pacific Northwest.
Very cool. Very cool. I have a parallel to you a little bit. So I started my undergrad after I finished there, I went to St. Martin's, and I did poli-sci. I went into poli-sci, and it was exactly like you said, because I was thinking of becoming a lawyer, you know what I mean? And I just, it's all about like the hopper and the logistics of how you get a law through and this kind of stuff. At least that's the classes I was taking. And as much as they were interesting, like, they wanted us to go page, and volunteer at the Capitol and stuff like that. And I just didn't feel that in me. So that's when I changed too. Yeah. And it was hard to find, good sociology courses. So then I went into anthropology, but they're kind of hand in hand in a little,
They are.
a little. What would you say the differences are?
I always say that sociology is they're both the study of people, right?
More statistical?
Not necessarily. Sometimes, but not always. I think sociology is the study of living white people, and anthropology is the study of dead non-white people.
Oh, okay.
That tends to be the case.
I love it.
That's a little bit of an oversimplification, but
yeah. I asked Tony Campello the same question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and because he's a sociologist, and I'll have to get into that later. But he gave me, because we used to talk about symbolic interactionism, and I said, it's so hard to understand symbolic interactionism, really understand it. And we were in a colloquium with all these kind of academic heads, and we know what it is. And he kind of said, okay, tell me, and none of them could,
right?
So he was basically validated my question, and then he gave the response, but we won't get into that. We'll talk about that later. So you start your doctorate then at UW, right?
I did.
And now here's where the cool story comes, right?
Okay.
So the bicycle story, right? How you got your bicycle? Do you remember that?
The bicycle story?
No, because you got a settlement.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah,
right?
no, I forgot
I
forgot that that's like a punchline to that story.
Yeah, it's
okay.
a punchline to the story.
That's
I didn't
funny.
mean to give it away.
Yeah,
so
no, I still
prequel.
have that bicycle. Okay.
Right. So I set it forward. Now it's year earlier.
How did I end up with that
earlier
right.
in the episode, right?
Yeah. I always like to tell people it's my red convertible, right?
Right. Exactly.
My midlife crisis. So when I got to UW, I was studying sociology, but with a focus on global institutions. That's how I would later go on to, start a class in globalization and later write a textbook on globalization.
Yeah, I love that class, by the way.
And so was studying that and had this background in activism. I'd done a lot of activism type stuff as an undergrad at OU, just kind of like campus sandbox politics type stuff for the most part. It was involved in anti-racist organizations and
kind of stuff you were doing with Brick.
Very much that kind of thing. So environmental groups and human rights stuff and just kind of a gamut of stuff. And I should say, like, this is the 90s. In a lot of ways, activism looked very different then than it does now. I mean, that's
unpack that a bit.
Oh God, there we go.
Right,
That's the rabbit hole that we'll spend the rest of the day on if we're not careful.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just as a starting point, it existed at a time when there wasn't social media. It existed at a time when we were probably a lot less polarized as a society. And in a lot of ways, I think our activism was really informed by the 60s. I mean, even though it was the 90s, like, we weren't really inventing a whole lot that was new. Right. And so for me, when I wanted to learn something, I was reading, MLK, or I was reading the Port Huron Statement, or all these, like, these social movements that occurred in the 1960s. They were the roadmap. They were the model. Right. And so there's a concept I've been trying to deal with and learn about the last couple of years, and people have been labeling it a lot of different ways. But for me, it's the distinction between sort of activism then, activism now. Is you've probably heard people use the term like identitarianism or identity politics to talk about activism now. Yeah. So the counterpoint to that is what I would call universalism. Okay. And they can often end up in the same place, and they can certainly be inspired by the same like underpinning. Both groups can be concerned about racial inequality, or can be concerned about economic inequality, or war, or whatever. Right. What's different is kind of how they approach it once they start with that shared value. So with identity politics, you kind of start with, you look around at different groups of people demographically, and you say, what does this one group have that this other group doesn't have? Like, here's the relationship of men to women, or here's the relationship of gay people to straight people, or of white people to African Americans, or something like that, right?
Even economics, all that. Yeah,
right. And so it always starts with this idea of like this sort of comparison between groups. Universalism, it starts with a value, and it says, okay, what's something that everybody should have? And then it asks who doesn't have it.
Right.
So like take something like voting as a way to come at this from two different ways, right?
Right.
So universalism says, okay, voting is something everybody ought to have. Everybody ought to have access to participate in the democracy and be part of their society and all that. And then it says, and who doesn't have access to this? Okay, well, look, over here, women can't vote. And so we're going to need to do something about that. We're going to have to, pass a constitutional amendment in this case, right, to ensure that women have the right to vote. Or African Americans are being denied the vote in the South, and so we're going to need the Voting Rights Act, and we're going to need some maybe federal troops, who knows what, to make sure and ensure that African Americans have access to the ballot there.
Right.
Starts with the value and then says who doesn't make it there.
Got you.
Identitarianism, identity politics starts the opposite direction, and it says, okay, look at let's take women and men as an example here. Women don't have the right to vote, going back 100 and something years here.
Right.
Women don't have the right to vote. Men do have the right to vote. That's a difference between them. They're unequal on that basis. And so what can we do to make women equal to men, or what can we do to respond to that inequality that exists? I know it kind of sounds like it's the same thing, but in a way it's different. It's like I said, it's starting from a different place.
Well, it's cause and effect, right?
Like, I think maybe that's a way to put that distinction.
Right.
And like I said, I've been spending the last few years just trying to kind of wrap my brain around these distinctions myself. What I can say is that they're not new historically, that like people have had this argument forever. My favorite way back when example of this is William Garrison, who was this white Northern anti-slavery activist that published this newspaper called The Liberator.
Okay.
And
I've heard of that.
Right.
Yes.
And so his sort of friend and counterpart, and eventually like adversary in a way, was Frederick Douglass.
Right.
And so Frederick Douglass was this former slave, this African American, who also published anti-slavery pieces through this thing called the North Star. Well, they started off. Douglass originally worked for Garrison, worked at the Liberator, writing stories in his newspaper and all that kind of thing. That goes on for a while. But Garrison, as you get closer to the Civil War, Garrison gets like more and more radical, I guess you could say.
Okay.
And he gets to the point where he's like, the U.S. Constitution, the whole thing is bad. The Constitution is bad. The people who wrote it are bad. The Declaration of Independence is bad. The ideas that are in it are bad. We got to start over. That the country is built on racism, that it's the foundation of the country, to the point that like we just got to burn the whole thing down and kind of start over from scratch.
Right.
That's Garrison.
Right.
Douglass says, no. Like, the ideas are great. People were hypocrites. I mean, sure, I think he would have been the first to say, like, Jefferson or somebody like that was a hypocrite.
Total, yeah.
But he says, no, but the ideas are great. I mean, that we have civic responsibility and civil rights, that we have voting, that we have, a Bill of Rights, and that we guarantee things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion. It's like, oh, that's great.
Right.
The problem is that not everybody has access to it.
Gotcha.
That was Garrison, the identitarian, and Douglass, the universalist, having that argument, back in the mid-1800s.
Very interesting.
What's so weird about it, and what so parallels our time in a way,
we're garrisoning now, right?
Oh, we are so there, right? And and you can see, by the way, the same argument exists. I'd say another really good example of this distinction is MLK in the 1960s, who's very much a universalist, and comparing him to early Malcolm X.
I was going to say Malcolm
and
X.
Nation of Islam. Not later Malcolm X. By the end of his life, Malcolm X, I think, has become a universalist himself. But he definitely starts off as an identitarian. Right. So you see, the parallel kind of thing that happens there. And we very much have that same kind of debate in a lot of ways going on in like activism circles in our world and in our society right now.
Right.
What's so interesting to me about it is, remember, Garrison is a fairly wealthy white newspaper owner who's like super, super radical.
Right.
And
he can afford the ability to be radical
and
like to be idealistic
in a way.
Right.
And then, Frederick Douglass, he's a former slave.
Right.
He's African American. And yet he's more like kind of reasonable in his approach. Or I don't know if that's the right word for it, but certainly more universalist in his approach.
Right.
And so I look for, and I see examples of that kind of thing right now, where you see like, sometimes kind of more privileged, kind of white, kind of college educated activists, sort of talking down in a way to people of color and women and
like
immigrants.
the white mother movement in Portland,
that they're not being radical enough. No, I don't know
there was a mother, not to interrupt you, but there was a mother movement, and they were a bunch of white moms that were coming out, for Black Lives Matter. And they didn't understand why a lot of the black mothers and black people were challenging that, because they were kind of speaking for them, right? Like as if we need you to speak for us,
right?
You know what I mean? So is that where you're kind of?
I think so. I mean,
yeah.
In that regard, a lot of my favorite writers in recent times are folks that around social movements and politics anyway, have been folks that are very much on the left, but they are maybe taking some aim at where a lot of the left and a lot of activism has gone in recent years. Not because they disagree with the goals, but sometimes they disagree with the tactics, or maybe they even sort of disagree with some of the philosophy around it. And oftentimes those are, women or people of color. I'm thinking of people like Adolph Reed or Steve QJ or Nadine Strasser, the former head of the ACLU.
Right.
All of them have been kind of critical of, whatever we want to name it, like identitarianism or sort of woke culture or cancel culture. I mean, I don't want to get into too much of an argument about what the right terminology to use is. And those words are often kind of loaded, and I don't mean to use them in a loaded kind of way.
Yeah, I get it.
But there's something that's been going on for, 6 or 7 years, kind of starting on college campuses and kind of moved out into society more generally, that is that looks different than activism had looked before. And there's some benefits to that. I think there's a lot of use to a lot of the academic concepts that have come out of it. I mean, things like intersectionality and these kind of terms, they have real use and merit in an analytical framework.
Gotcha.
But they don't always have a lot of utility and use once they get sort of taken to street level.
There's no application.
Politics. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, or the application can even be counterproductive because it can alienate potential allies and that kind of thing. And so there's some good writers out there right now talking about that, but it hasn't really, it doesn't get a lot of kind of public attention, and it doesn't sort of hit the mainstream. I mean, the press wants everything to be volatile, and
they can't sell it
to be at each other's throats and all that, right? So so everything is like, I'm more outraged than you. No, you're and so there's this kind of constant fight going on. And like I said, I think that there's some really good voices out there. Ben Burgess is another, one of the editors of Jacobin magazine. Recently wrote a book about some of this stuff that's quite good. And these are folks with like long-term, like unquestionable
devotion,
lefty credentials and all that. I mean, you're not going to say when Nadine Strasser writes a book about the problem with censorship and even censorship when pushed from the left, right? You're not going to challenge her as being like not committed to like progressive social values. I mean, she's got 50, 60 years of experience in that area.
Yeah.
And so, so anyway, those are some of the voices I've been like, I don't even want to say paying attention to, but like, interacting with or getting something from of recent. You have to be super careful too, because, the same people that or the other group that's saying that like they don't like what progressive activism looks like right now is the alt-right Trumpy kind of, out there folks that I used to have a roommate that always used to say, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Right. I was actually going to say that earlier. You know what I mean?
Yeah, super important.
When you're talking about the Constitution and Frederick Douglass, right? You throw it all out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So when you talk about that, what do you think? You explain like that activism that you took up with WTO and everything, and explain the could you correlate the universalism, what you're talking about, with that experience versus nowadays kind of thing?
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, there's a lot of places where you can see sort of changes in the approach that's taken. One of the most clear ones to me is being what I would call change-oriented or solution-oriented.
Okay.
So when we were protesting the World Trade Organization, we had a pretty clear like agenda in the sense, those of us that were protesting. We saw environmental problems being caused by national laws being overturned by these sort of trade agreements and things. We saw human rights being violated, child labor and sweatshops and all that kind of stuff happening as a result of these types of international trade agreements. And so the idea was always, well, here's how we fix this. Like,
Right.
here's, if we could do this thing instead, or if we could stop this organization or institution from doing this thing, then we can change that in a way.
We're going to stop the big bad entity.
Right.
Kind of
and you
thing.
do that by changing structures and changing
Right.
laws and changing social systems and maybe sometimes by changing individual people, but I think more often than not by changing these big kind of
Right.
macro level institutions. There's a resignation that I see in a lot of modern activism that it makes me reluctant to even call it activism. It's
Really?
it's like going, okay, well, you're in this position and you're in this position. This is part of that kind of identitarian approach, right? It's identifying people's identities and like where they fit into social schemes, where they fit into our various hierarchies around race and sex and wealth and all these different hierarchies in society. And so it's identifying them and it's putting people in their places, but it's not necessarily saying, and we're going to fix this by, or we're going to change this by. So it's more like
They're not adding solutions. They're just pointing out the problem.
in a way, yeah.
Okay.
That's a piece of it. I think that's
Right.
there, and it's not. I don't want to say that it's always there, but it can be something that it falls victim to. It's one of the the things that like activists today need to be on guard about is making sure that they've got concrete, implementable, tangible solutions. And another thing that can throw it off, I think, in the same way, is when there's an inauthenticity in who's speaking and kind of what they're speaking about. So let me try and give you a real concrete example here.
Okay.
Right? So after the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and also the killing of Eric Garner in New York, these happened about the same time.
Right.
And this is when the Black Lives Matter movement really started to get legs,
Right.
and
Started
really
to move.
started to move, and started. People were paying more attention to it, and it was in the press, and there were big protests and all this. And one of the real epicenters of these big protests was Baltimore.
Okay.
And so, and that was true for a couple of reasons. In part, that was true because of the African American man that was, and I hate this, I'm forgetting his name right now,
Right.
that was killed in the back of a police wagon or something.
I vaguely remember
They
this.
gave him kind of a rough ride, they called it, and they had him handcuffed, and he bounced around, and he got like a concussion, and eventually ended up dying from this, right?
Right.
So part of it was the specifics that had happened in Baltimore, but I think a much bigger part of it was just the history of Baltimore, right? You had
Baltimore. Like, have you ever seen The Wire, by the way?
It's
It's a little
a few
sensationalized,
episodes
but
here
it's
and
pretty
there, right.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that Freddie Gray?
Freddie Gray.
Freddie Gray.
Yeah,
Freddie
yeah.
Gray. Yeah.
And so, anyway, so Baltimore, this town has, huge amounts of endemic poverty
Absolutely.
and long-term police violence. So it wasn't just Freddie Gray. It was this whole environment that existed there. And so you had these big, oftentimes pretty riotous protests that started where there was, there were a lot of people that were really ticked off and angry, and you could really see that in the protests. And there was also, there was some looting and there were some fires and all that. And I'm not here to criticize those things. I mean,
Right.
I get that people react and that's, their experience and all that. So far, so good. This is all the part of it that looks like traditional activism to me, and that I get.
Right. You see the rise. You see the explosion. You
Right.
See, yeah.
So a couple of months later, you start having Black Lives Matter chapters show up on college campuses, including, among other places, on the Yale College campus.
Right.
And this is when you had the incident where you had the two faculty members there. I think the last name was like Chrisakis or something like that. And there had been a campus email that had gone out from the administration that said, don't be racist on Halloween, basically. Don't wear like racist Halloween costumes and
Right.
stuff. And there was a faculty member that responded and said, hey, students should have free expression and they're old enough to make these decisions for themselves. They didn't encourage racist Halloween costumes. They just kind of discouraged the administration from sending this email.
Right.
Anyway, and it just blew up into this whole mess on the Yale campus when this happened. And so you had students proclaiming themselves part of the Black Lives Matter movement. Some of them, black students and people of color, a lot of them white students, probably the majority of them white students that are involved in this, trying to get this professor, trying to get this professor at Yale fired and all that. And eventually they were somewhat successful in that goal.
Really?
Well, to parallel these two things, I mean, to me, these are day and night, where you've got, poor and sort of downtrodden people in the streets of Baltimore ticked off because people are dying in front of them. I get it.
Right.
And then you've got these students at Yale saying, look, look at like the oppressive situation that we're
in. Yeah.
And these are like the most privileged people on the
Right,
planet
right.
because they're students at Yale. I mean,
Yeah.
even when they're students of color at Yale, they're
They're
still
at Yale.
they're still at
Yeah,
Yale,
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And so that's when you see that kind of a shift, or that's a good example of seeing that kind of shift
Right.
occur. And so like the first part is activism, and it changes the world, and it's universalism, and it's anger being devoted towards, a just cause. And the second part, it's not that they're entirely wrong in all their pieces of it,
Right.
but it starts to create something that both it takes the eyes off the more serious offenses, like if
For
you,
sure.
like if you think
That's
that
a-
what this
that's a
professor
great
said in an
point.
email is bad, like wait till you hear about the prison system,
Right.
right?
That's a great. They're almost armchairing, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it takes the eyes off or the focus off of it, and it also gives sort of the other side so much ammunition. It's like
Right.
a wrapped Christmas present to somebody like a Donald Trump who can say, "Look what those crazy lefties are doing out there. This is the stuff they care about." If this is the biggest thing that they have to complain about, then like I guess life's not so bad in the U.S. of A.
Right.
And
right.
so
it takes the focus off the real problem.
It can be counterproductive.
Absolutely.
And so I'm still very much an advocate of activism. I'm still very much like, on board with the causes of anti-racism and anti-sexism and certainly a focus on the massive and growing inequality that exists in our society.
Massively.
I just want us to do it successfully. I want us to be smart as opposed to just reactionary. Because I think what happens is you take a bunch of 18, 19-year-old kids and you feed them a little sociology and you feed them a little bit of outrage on social media and you put them in these bubble groups and Facebook and things like that, and they get pissed off. And again,
They're in these echo chambers.
the echo chambers for
Yeah.
sure, and the anger is legitimate. But it's not always productive. It's like being reactionary, being like angry is not always how you manage to change the world. I want to see people be smart. I want to see people take that anger and like be smart.
With that smart, how would you suggest, let's say, pretty privileged guy, who even notices their privilege, and they want to make a difference. They don't want to fall short of not acting, right? They don't want to be complacent, right? So, change doesn't come on the wings of inevitability. I'm sure I'm totally slaughtering that MLK. But so in your opinion, what's good activism at that point when like this is a good opportunity for us to learn about this? Like how, for instance, you told me something that stuck with me when I went to Philly. You said you can go into these poverty places, but you're coming with your past, you're coming with your privilege. You can leave. They can't, so, or the, people that are stuck in that situation, or not even stuck. That's their home. That's what they love.
Right.
That's where they're at. So when I went to Philadelphia, I stayed in North Philly, and I was in a big, large black neighborhood. I lived in a food desert. It was a culture shock for me. When I first got there, I remember I was at a store and I was the only white guy in the store. And I really realized, remember we did that. We broke down the demonization of African Americans in film, like just we went through all that and we really looked at that. And I remember being on the phone and going with my wife at the time and saying I have to put my phone away because I was scared for no reason, just because I was surrounded by black people. And I can admit this, A month later, I'm getting knocked on the door by my neighbors, and they're giving me scrapple, And 2 weeks later, I'm getting invited to, because they'll make a house a bar and call it a block party.
Sure.
And they'd invite me, some of the best people in the world, but I can leave.
Right.
Do you get what I'm saying? So my point being is that, I've always said, I think that these privileged people who really want to make a difference, not people who are just, they're spoiled, they need to get out of that area, they need to pick up themselves by their bootstraps, even though they don't have any boots, and get going. I don't know if you can bring people around that way, but would you suggest just, like immersing yourself? I mean, that's the only way you're going to understand. Or is that counterproductive, to immerse yourself because you can leave? I was so conflicted in my time living there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I could leave, and I was saying at first, this is changing my life. But it was very like a novelty, right? I felt like it was
you're on vacation.
Yeah, I'm coming to learn how the poor,
Right.
subjugated people live. Oh, ho, 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 ho. I left going, what was that all? You know what I mean? Do you get what I'm asking?
I do. So, I mean, I guess I'd say two things. The first is it's always okay to get to know people. Like,
right.
And that doesn't mean like impinge on them or, like kind of, go buy all the houses in their neighborhood so you can live next door to them or something like that.
Right.
But I don't think that there's ever inherently anything wrong with people getting to know other people, and that can be people from different backgrounds than you and that are having a different like lived experience than you.
Right.
That's great.
Right.
As a concept. The other piece of it, I mean, I don't have like a simple piece of advice that says, here's how you do activism, right? And here's where I kind of started this by me saying I'm becoming more academic and maybe a little less activist. Well, let me circle back to that right now to say, go learn some history. I don't just mean you, but I mean like anyone.
Yeah.
Like, so
we need a lot of people learning history.
The arguments that people are having right now.
They're like, don't read a book. You don't need a book. You know what I mean?
The arguments that people are having are not new arguments.
Okay.
And the questions around how, well, I mean, one of the things that I kind of like, one of those comments you see from time to time on the internet is, we had to change this, how we were doing activism. We had to change this because what we were doing wasn't working. And I hate that when I hear it, because I'm like, what do you mean wasn't working? Like, by what metric? Show what's the data that you're saying shows that it's not working. I think it was. I think that, I think it's a big kind of a poke in the eye to people like MLK to say what the approach that he, I don't want to say pioneered. He wasn't the only person that ever came up with it, but certainly is most associated with in American history. Yeah. That it wasn't doing anything or that it wasn't working. Like change isn't always fast, but change was happening. And we're not getting there. So we need to like suddenly be, I don't want to say more radical, because this is not a question of radical versus extreme versus moderate or something like that. But the idea that we needed to, really take a fundamentally different approach, a more identitarian approach, perhaps, right? I think it's both an insult to all of the good that people managed to do
and
once
the
upon a
sacrifice
time,
they did,
and the sacrifice and all that. And I think it's also just inaccurate. It's like people are saying, well, things haven't gotten better because they don't know enough about history to know what's changed or what's gotten better. I mean, which is not to say that there's not still a lot of improvement to do and things.
Well, when they're saying let's make America great again, that you just haven't seen history, right?
Sure.
I mean, like, we have to go backwards, right?
What
to
part?
a place. Yeah. What part?
What part specifically about America
was great?
What are you talking about? Like what period of time? That's the question I always have with that.
Yeah.
It's a great. There's a great phrase to describe that concept that comes from the. We were talking about the Dead Kennedys earlier. The Jello Biafra Mojo Nixon country album that they did together. Okay. And there's a line in a song there, or I think it's a title actually, "Nostalgia for an Age That Never Existed." Oh, I love that. Yeah. Wow. Such a great phrasing of that concept.
That is great. I love that. Nostalgia, because we love to remember it our way or think of it our way. Right. And only, it's like a, not to simplify it, but it's like a girlfriend you broke up with, right? And you only remember the good parts. You know what I mean? Yeah. You don't remember, and that's why people get back together. And then a week later, they're like, why'd I do this?
I think people don't want to simplify it, because I think if you simplify it, you realize how ridiculous it sounds at times to go, well, that's it. That's just let's make America great. Okay, well, we're constantly moving as society in a world that constantly going in the same direction. In a direction, maybe not the same direction, but we're all moving.
And it's just a direct attack to progressivism. Just like stop moving forward.
But why?
Right.
Why? Why do you want to?
It's an ideology, right? I fundamentally believe if you're not growing, you're dying. You know what I mean? And a lot of people. They don't want that.
Right.
You know what I mean?
That's for sure.
So
yeah, I want to see, when I see better activism, I want to see more historically informed activism. I want to see...
Give me better activism.
Right.
What's better activism to you?
More successful. Okay. Right. Moving the needle. Like that, ultimately, I mean, somebody says something in a movie that you don't like and you find offensive or something, right? Mm-hmm. And, you get pissed off about that, and you get it yourself, and you get a whole bunch of friends, and you write some letters, and you put some stuff. Nobody writes letters anymore. You tweet some stuff.
Fuck that movie. It needs to be shelved, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So you go and you're going to cancel it, and maybe you're even successful in doing that.
Right.
And then my question, let's say the thing you were offended about was something racist in the film, right? So tell me, now you've got the film canceled, and you've got, you've smeared the name, rightly smeared. You've helped them smear themselves, the director or the actor, whoever, was making these decisions. How many black people did that free from prison?
Right.
How many immigrant kids got out of cages as a result of you doing that? So
it's roundabout activism. It's almost about yourself.
If you can't,
it's like
measure quantitatively an effect on the injustices in society as a result of your activism, then it's not activism, or it's not successful. Like I said, I want to see people out of prison. Right. I want to see people not dying. I want to see people better fed. Like, if those things aren't being accomplished, then it's just kind of like this performative show where we talk back and forth with each other and we argue about things. But then it is making yourself feel morally and ethically complete.
Right.
I've done my part.
I've done my part.
Well, yeah, and there's a diversion.
But you're not changing the world.
No, and there's a skip from, because the technology's accelerated that, right? Because of selfishness and self-promotion, right? So I want to be seen as a woke person that they even have ads, are you backing this? Are you backing this? You put this flag around your picture so that everybody knows you're pro LGBTQ. You do this.
It's like on paper you're backing it. On paper.
Right. And it becomes more about how are people going to see me rather than fixing the problem.
Almost diversion. Hey, don't forget about me.
Right.
Don't forget about me.
And that's a really slippery slope.
Like thoughts and prayers, don't forget about me.
Yeah.
And there's a critique of an identitarian approach versus a universalist approach.
Right.
Is that identitarianism is not inconsistent with neoliberal corporate capitalism in a way that more traditional activism. I mean, MLK, he wants a poor people's march. He wants a
right.
He advocates socialism. I mean, he's an adamantly anti-capitalist in his approach.
Yeah.
Within an identitarian framework, the idea is there can still be inequality as long as there's, demographic representation in those unequal groups. And so, of course, corporate America is happy to get on board a sort of woke bandwagon and say, like, okay, well, Nike is going to give this percentage of its profits to these,
because being woke is
civil rights
money.
organizations, right? Or, Gillette's going to have the ads with the razors, and we're critiquing manhood and all this kind of thing. Corporate America is happy to do that because it's not fundamentally challenging the structure. It's only challenging where people land in that structure, which is why the thing I was saying earlier about identifying where people fall into a hierarchy as opposed to eliminating the hierarchy.
Interesting. And it's all sold under the corporate morality, right? But there is none, of course. They have to sustain profits.
They're looking to make a buck.
They got to make a buck. And so it's measured that, well, we can be the good guy and make a buck.
Right.
Or look like the good guy and make a buck.
Be super skeptical of any social movement that is framed in such a way that a company that's still using sweatshops,
right? When Apple's
can
framing,
be your ally in that social movement.
Yeah, exactly. That is so interesting. So Apple is your ally in a social movement while people are jumping off into they got to put nets below. I think that's what it was. What people. Oh gosh, it's so interesting when you think of that because
look, Amazon donated all this money to this program, but their workers are absolutely running to the ringer.
Right. I heard Bezos say the other day, he said, I own 16% of Amazon, and people get mad at me for being so rich. Well, look at all the other percentages that I've made other people billions and billions of dollars. I'm like, that is such a fucking diversion.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's such a huge diversion. And you said something to me that stuck with me so hard, and it's from that is follow the money. But the other thing is, why do Americans or Westerners or people in general under a capitalist society, why do they put up with this poverty and the profit of the country always exceeding, but that big gator gap where the wages stay the same, you know what I mean? And we have this huge gap. Why do we should be making $25 an hour minimum wage right now, Why do we put up with this? And you said something, I don't know if you remember this. You said, because we always think we're going to make it.
Right. That's part of the sort of the lottery of a capitalist economy is this idea that, well, maybe I'll be the one who ends up rich. That's why people don't want more taxation.
That's right.
Or they don't want.
They really think they're going to end up rich.
Right. And of course, it's not true for most people.
Right.
And it's very much like a lottery. It's like thinking that you're better off playing the lottery than not playing the lottery.
Right.
Like the house ultimately always wins.
Always.
Right.
The casinos exist because they win.
Right.
You know what I mean? So, let's bridge into like, do you have any further on that you wanted to make?
Yeah. Let me give you a phrase here, right?
Okay.
I think maybe the world is more of a zero-sum game than we're willing to admit. So,
okay, now you got to unpack that one.
Okay. So, again, another one of the kind of common phrases in modern kind of social justice circles, right, is this idea that like one person's rights don't come at the expense of another person's rights. Except I don't think it's true.
No, it isn't.
When to use an example we were using earlier, when women got the right to vote, men's votes were diluted by half. Right, and they were every individual man in the the sphere of democracy had half as much power as they did
because
before.
The first time in history a woman could say, I can cancel your vote out.
Right, exactly. Now, I'm not saying that was a bad thing, and it wasn't fair when only men got to vote, obviously, right? And so I think it's good that women got the right to vote.
Absolutely.
That's not a very controversial thing to say in 2021. Right, so of course it's good women got the right to vote. But it was a zero sum in the sense that there's only so much democratic political power out there, and when one person is denied the franchise, everyone else's vote is increased a little bit, and when they get the franchise, everybody else's vote is decreased a little bit.
Absolutely.
And it's not just limited to that. It's true of everything. It's true of the whole social sphere and social influence. When same-sex marriage becomes recognized, in a way it dilutes like the power and status of heterosexuals in society a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit in the sense that like they don't have the unique monopoly on the institution of marriage. On the institution,
yeah.
Right. And this was a known like philosophy within the left for a long time. It goes back to Marx and Marxism and all that, is this idea of like there's winners and losers, and it's the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat.
Yeah.
Right. So the idea is that things are essentially a zero-sum game. Well, there's kind of this idea out there right now, which when you hear people advocating for like a change in this thing or some rights for this group or a change in the way this media corporation operates or something, and they'll say, well, hey, we can all do better. It's not a zero-sum game, but it's not true. And and it's the left saying it, and the left knows it's not true because it's a zero-sum game has been like a central. I don't want to say it's a value. It's like a premise of leftism for as long as there's been leftism. And so what's happening is people are arguing disingenuously. People are saying things either because they don't know,
right?
In which case there's that historical ignorance that I'm talking about, or they're saying things and they know, but they're just kind of being dishonest to win the argument.
Right.
And that's what I worry about. When I worry about like where we're at as a society right now, are we no longer capable of arguing in good faith because we're so polarized and we're so divided? Like maybe the empire has just fallen.
Right.
And what you're seeing right now, people are willing to do things that are fundamentally unethical. They're going to lie. They're going to use violence. I mean, people say like violence is the last resort. And then they're like out of the next breath is like, let's go to the rally and punch the people that we disagree with.
Absolutely.
And they deserve it because they're right. They're racist and they're Nazis and they're neo skinheads and all that kind of thing. But we're thinking about what they deserve, not about ourselves and like what's appropriate action on our parts. Right. And so maybe when we're to the point that we're justifying violence and we're justifying lying and stuff, it seems to me that's not what you do when you're trying to have a society. That's what you do when you're having a war. So like, and I don't know what the answer is there, but maybe we are past the point that we are trying to have like a more perfect union, and maybe we're just at war. And then anything goes, right? Because it's war.
Maybe we're already in the civil war.
That's a really good point. Like not a cold civil war, but like how would you define it? Like a
war.
There's a boiling
civil war, and I quote that.
Right.
That wouldn't be. It wouldn't be the same type of war.
Right. We're not going to put on green or gray and blue jackets and
we're not
march off into a
giant
field.
Fucking lead balls.
That stuff looked really hot to wear, by the way.
Right.
And not very mobile.
Right.
Yeah.
And war doesn't always have to be super bloody, but I'm defining war here less by like the bullets and more by the idea that you've given up on the idea that there's a shared value or a shared destiny, and you're saying, no, we're irreconcilable differences.
It happened so fast, or maybe it didn't, and I just was ignorant and didn't notice it. But I just felt like it. I mean, I felt it coming, but it was so accelerated through Trump's presidency.
Sure,
for me, and it was so sensationalized.
Although Trump, you gotta, and let me, I can't
it's like
emphasize this enough.
Okay.
Trump is the symptom, not the cause.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I said that. I was like, he is. You think that's he's just there, and that's what.
Right.
No, that's just a byproduct.
Yeah, he won because of the symptoms. You know what I mean?
And he could go away tomorrow, and there's still going to be Trumpism, because Trumpism is way bigger than him.
Absolutely. And there's we've always talked about that there's a mix to create a social movement or any type of feeling or any type of cultural lash. And they've done all the stuff in the book that, like, we're going to take the books, like, we're going to demonize education, right? First of all, you have these entrepreneurs coming out now, like, God bless them, but Gary Vaynerchuk or somebody like one of these guys who are like, I'll pay you not to go to college. You shouldn't go to college. You know what I mean? And I get the debt and I get the institution and what's going on, but it's almost like, don't read the books, just and that is a recipe for disaster, because you don't get the history. Right. You don't understand what's happening. You don't understand that. You just like, take our jobs. They're taking our jobs.
That's double-ended too, because then you're also like not, and I hate to say it, you're not educating, but you're also like, well, just don't worry about the debt. We'll just take care of you. We'll just pay you this, but you're also not educating, and so it's burning at both sides.
I have no idea. Maybe you can answer this. This is way off the subject, but I have no idea how. I'm calling it like the great ruse, right? How did conservatives sell middle America on their ideals and their policies? I mean, I know why, kind of, but was it pure ignorance?
I thought capitalism.
I don't want to call people, ignorant.
Who's a conservative?
Them.
Right.
I mean, in that question, who's a conservative, right? Because like certainly the new right and Trump and that crowd,
they're not conservative.
They're not conservative at all.
They're more radical than they want change, right?
Right. They absolutely want change.
They want change, But I just don't know how you.
By the way, I should add that term that we were using a minute ago, identitarianism and identity politics. The term itself was first used to study evolving new right movements in Europe. So before anybody on the left was either being called or calling themselves or otherwise using the term identity politics, it was being used to describe neo-Nazi movements in Europe in like the 60s and 70s.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
That's and so because what more identity? What if the essence of identity politics is, here's my demographic profile. I'm going to advocate on the basis that I'm like a member of those groups that I sort of fit into, right? Well, who did that first other than, like white nationalists? Right. White nationalism is identity politics. It's the ultimate identity politics.
Ultimate. Yeah.
Which is, so the thing is, then we have to ask, is that the right approach kind of for the response? I said I wanted, data, quantifiable gains. So we've seen the rise of Trumpism. Let me use a more even extreme than Trump kind of example here for a second. When I was that punk kid in Oklahoma back in the 80s, we had a real problem with skinheads. Like, the neo-Nazis back then were called skinheads, right? And they were all over the place in Oklahoma City and in Tulsa, and were really a thing. Like a good friend of mine was put into the hospital and had a bunch of ribs broken and his nose basically kicked off his face by him. Yeah. Ryan and Tom Metzger that would later move to Idaho and start Aryan Nation, right? Right. They're from Tulsa. Like that's where this all kind of, or I shouldn't say all, where some of it came from, right? Right. The thing about these skinheads at the time was, and I didn't realize this when I was a teenager. When I was a teenager, let's go street fight with them and kick their asses, and, whatever, because that's what you want to do. When you're 16, 17 years old and you aren't a racist, you're like, I want to go find these racists and kick their asses, right? But, you get a little older and you're like, well, you know what? These folks are, individually, I don't like them, but they're not really the problem. Right. Like, that there's bigger systems. I'm much more concerned about the police, at some point than I am the skinheads, or I'm much more concerned about the military or war or something than I am, a few skinheads in Tulsa and Oklahoma City. But they were marginalized. Right. Ultimately, They couldn't go on a radio show. They couldn't go on a TV show. They certainly couldn't run for office and win something. Even in a place like conservative Oklahoma, these folks were marginalized.
Absolutely, yeah.
In the last 6 or 7 years, that kind of extremism has become less marginalized. I think that's what we saw with the extremes of Trump. Trump was a little bit cleaner face, if you can imagine, on people like Richard Spencer,
right.
or even some of the people that were working in his administration, right? That were definitely like Stephen Miller, people like
right.
that were definitely getting right to the borderline, if
right.
not beyond it, of,
right.
of like true like activist white supremacism,
exactly.
white nationalism kind of
yeah.
things. So these folks
how did they fly that under the radar?
Exactly.
That was like
there's the question.
It was like the original censorship.
So remember I said things were working, and then the left kind of changed how it was operating because things weren't working, but they were working. But right.
This is great. This is a good point.
If these folks have come to power, maybe we're doing it wrong. Like us, like the response, the left, the anti-racist or whatever, like instead of just doubling down on the things that aren't always working, maybe this is when we go, okay, just practically, are we taking the right approach? Not the most like morally justified approach. It's real easy to go like, I'm morally justified in punching a Nazi. I'm morally justified in, canceling somebody who says something remotely racist. I'm
right.
I leave aside like this right and wrong kind of moral argument about action. Just tell me what works. Like what makes Richard Spencer less powerful? What makes him more powerful? And you have to be careful, I think, because when you're canceling his speech at a college someplace, or when you're punching him on national TV, or when you're whatever, those things can serve to empower these folks, to give them more credibility, to make them get more attention. Those kinds of things.
Yeah,
it's not always the case. There's times when the best thing you could possibly do would be to punch him. Probably.
Right.
I'm not making a universal line about the ethics of these kinds of actions. I'm making an argument for being smart about how we approach it. Because if they're becoming more empowered, if Trumps are winning elections, if the far right and neo-Nazism has more influence on our politics than it did 8 or 9 or 10 or 20 years ago.
Gotcha.
Then we the rest of us are doing something wrong. And we got to be doing something right if we want to stop
let's get micro. Let's talk about the differences, what the left has done. Like now, 10 years ago, we weren't seen as if I said I was a liberal, I wasn't seen as a person that wanted to defund the police and break everything down and destroy the like the gentleman you were talking that worked with Frederick Douglass. What was his Garrison?
Garrison, yeah.
What was the shift then? What was the change? I feel like you probably have some examples.
Well,
and if we didn't think it was working, so you're saying we switched. What was the switch? What did we do?
So right at the heart of the switch is social media and online access, right? So about the same time, you've got the big social media companies, Facebook and others, and also the development of the iPhone, which meant that people could have not just social media, but social media all the time.
In their pocket.
And so that led to, these walling offs and silos and echo chambers and all that. I think that's a huge part of it that can't be understated. Part of it has to do with 9/11 and the reactions to that I think we're still dealing with in some ways. I mean, a lot of the messages that people got out of 9/11 was these very stark, black and white lines. If you remember
there was such an increased nationalism at that point. Right? Now it's disappeared, right?
Do you remember Dick Cheney, you're with us or you're with the terrorists?
Right.
I think it was Dick Cheney. Maybe it was Donald Rumsfeld. Anyway, one of those folks said
I think it was Rumsfeld.
Maybe. Yeah. But there's the quote at the time, you're with us or you're with the terrorists.
Right.
Sounds remarkably similar to the kind of language of dichotomization that I see people using today. Which are you? Are you an anti-racist or are you racist? Right. Are you against, are you transphobic or are you in favor of trans rights? Are you, and so a generation,
which just shoots down discourse.
A generation has been socialized into black and white thinking, has been socialized into what I'm going to call catastrophizing. Because 9/11, if anything, was catastrophizing, right? It was not that it wasn't a horrible day, but it was like the end of the world,
right?
Has it struck anybody else that so far we've had like 200 times as many deaths from COVID,
right,
as we had from 9/11,
right?
And people today are like, well, people are overreacting to COVID, and I'm like, look at how much we reacted to 1/200th as much
Right.
death, right? And so,
and do you think the people that attacked us, that were living with bombs in their backyards and their kids were playing in those bombs with the big USA symbol on the side or whatever, you know what I mean? When they built that, compared to the I'm not taking away from the 3,000 people that perished,
sure.
but you know, we've been bombing over there, and,
right,
and
to the tune of probably 500,000 or 1 million people
absolutely.
or more since then.
Right,
Yeah.
right, but it's that whole thing of lives are worth more, I guess they think.
So you got a generation raised on catastrophe, raised on the idea that this is the scariest, most dangerous times ever, and then you combine that with social media and all the problems that causes, the outrage building, the siloing and the groupthink that causes. And it doesn't surprise me that one of the ways that comes out sideways is in not as effective of activism. Like, how do we know that it's okay? Let's use just one concrete example here.
Okay.
How do we know it's a good idea to punch a Nazi? Because everybody else says it's a good idea to punch a Nazi. Because everybody's on board with that.
Right.
And again, I'm not making a moral argument about whether or not it's ethically okay
to punch a Nazi.
I could care less if Richard Spencer gets his nose broken.
Right.
But I do care if that empowers him and sort of builds him more followers and more attention and stuff.
Well, that's the pacifist argument. You're giving them fuel when you do that, right?
Well, and I don't even know that I'm in favor of being a pacifist. Like I said, I'm more like a strategist. Like, I just want us to be smart. And if nothing else, I want us to be able to have these conversations. I want us to be able to say, okay, let's check on ourselves. Is this working? Is this getting us closer to this goal? Is this actually reducing racial inequality? Not like the kind of cosmetic surface of racial inequality. Is it actually the tangible things like home ownership and incarceration rates and longevity and likelihood of getting heart disease? Is it moving the needle on those
But how
things?
do you have discourse when people they just flat don't believe it?
Right. Yeah.
It's not about let's discuss the problem.
Right.
I don't see the problem. It doesn't exist. How do you? And there's not. I used to think that that was in the minority, the major minority.
Right.
But that's half the country now.
We got to get back to truth, like to the idea of truth. So
how do you do that?
Yeah. Right. I wish I knew.
Right.
At some point in the mid 20th century, philosophy went this direction with relativism and positivism and all that, and you see like the growth of this perspective of relativism or postmodernism.
Right, postmodernism.
Right, and it it's even rooted in the natural sciences, but it's the idea that the world's truths aren't knowable and exact, but are rather based on perspective, that they're subjective.
Right.
That your viewpoint of the world.
You can't rely on modernity to figure it out.
Right.
You know what I mean? And the science of it all. And
your view looks different than my view and all that.
Yeah,
and
I see a different brown than you see, kind of stuff.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah.
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 And so the world looks different to us, but
we're just having a little jam session here.
I know. I hear the music. Oh, I thought that was something that just happened at the end of a podcast.
You're fired, dude.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
What the hell that was?
You're like
elevator music.
He had a teleprompter. I guess I only have a few seconds. The music's coming in.
That's exactly what I thought. I was like, I better sum it up.
Cue the out.
Get to where I'm getting.
No, what were you saying?
Okay, so I think that there's some academic, like so many things, there's academic utility in the idea that there's no real truth out there.
Right.
Like, I think it's probably true in like an Einsteinian like universe way. Ultimately, does the universe care if we're rich or poor or die or live or, whatever? Universe doesn't care.
Nope.
That's not how stars work, right?
Nope. George Garland said the Earth will be fine. We'll be gone.
Right. So I understand the physical utility of relativism.
Okay.
And I also understand why it matters. I mean, it came from a really good place in like humanities departments in the 60s and that kind of thing, where it was like, well, we haven't been hearing from like these black authors, or we haven't been hearing like from women authors or something. It was oftentimes it was in written form, right?
Right. Berkeley.
And we need to bring them in, and and they're going to have a different experience and different voices than others. Great. I'm with you 100% there. But in a practical standpoint, when the human species starts saying there's no such thing as truth, all of a sudden what that does, we thought that what that was going to open up, I think. We thought that was going to open up the idea that marginalized voices would be heard. But if there's no truth, then from what vantage point do we criticize racism or sexism or Nazism or poverty or violence or pain or any of that.
Yeah.
Like all these things need to be anchored with some sort of like objectivism, some sort of like moral certainty to be able to even really say anything about them.
Good point.
So, so I'm not sure that we
got to get back to truth.
We got to get back to truth. I think practically, even if we leave aside the philosophical question of whether or not there's sort of like real objective truth, I think that what we've got to have is practically a commitment to truth that's going to allow us to move sort of the politics forward that I think a lot of progressively minded folks want to think that they want to move forward.
Right.
Like no more my truth and your truth. No, we got to just say that there's a truth. We've got to put some faith in objective science,
and we get there through the history and
the
the understanding of history.
We get there through that, and through the understanding of science, and through the understanding of math, and all of that,
and the precious stories, right? Understanding stories of people.
Right.
You know, we started this podcast to get to know one another. You know what I mean? To have sit down and get to know one another, because I've noticed that I have a friend who was very anti-LGBTQ until his nephew came out as gay. And now, you know, he has that tether. He has that experience. You know what I mean? I think that's a way to get to truth.
Yeah. No, I mean, sure, people can get there in a lot of different ways.
Right.
I think we just have to, right now, our arguments as a society are because we don't agree on truth. Right. Because like, you know, because I think that Biden won the election and you think that Trump won the election. And if I show you some evidence to the contrary, you just keep talking anyway. Not you personally.
Right. No. It's true.
But people just talk past it because there's no shared commitment to truth, which goes back to that war idea I was talking about before. Like, I mean, that's part of the way that we know that we're at war is not that we disagree on what we should do, but because we disagree on what is. We disagree on truth.
How do we get there? Do you have any suggestions? Like, what would you think? You know history, you know social movements, you know what's successful.
Is this a solution-oriented podcast?
No, I'm not trying to.
Because you might have found the wrong guest. If I knew all the answers, there'd be a big statue of me in the middle of town.
Right,
you know.
But
I was told there was.
When it comes to truth, how do you? I mean, I've just given up.
Yeah.
So I used to kind of talk and be it. Randy's still in it. He's still digging the ditch and going after people. I just couldn't keep doing it. It was dragging my life down.
I couldn't just keep justice warrior over here.
And I just couldn't keep arguing with you know. I had a pastor say to me one time, "You've never brought anybody to Jesus by winning an argument." You know what I mean? And it's the same thing. I mean, I can present what I believe is pure facts,
right?
But it's just this blowhard stuff over there. And I don't want to act like I know and you don't.
Who's the person who said you can't reason a person into a position they didn't, or out of a position they didn't reason themselves into?
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Right. So, and when you've built I don't know who told me this, but when you've built your whole life on facts that you're standing on, it's hard for you to tear those facts down. It would rip your whole existence down.
Sure. Yeah. People are not hyper rational. I mean, that's the thing that I started learning when I first started sociology, and I struggled with so much, and I still struggle with. Like, everybody has their hill to climb, their albatross or whatever. Here's mine. Like, no holds barred. I can't fathom that the rest of the human species is not super rational. And I know that they aren't. And all the surveys I've done and all the sociology I've done, I find over and over again that that's the case. You know, humans are moved by a lot of things, by their emotions and by their connections and their networks and all sorts of things. And on rare occasion, they're moved by data and facts. But they just usually aren't.
Right. And it's hard because you're looking at the data to form your belief system, right?
I sure am.
Rather than trying to use the data to support your argument.
I hope so. I mean, I'm sure that I'm biased too. Everybody is on some level.
It's hard to eradicate the bias.
But I don't think that you can just give up because of that. You can't just say everybody's biased and so I'm not going to pay attention to information.
Right.
No.
Yeah.
Like, I try and be non-biased. And I hear good things about that from my students in my classes. I hear that's one of the most common and frankly very heartwarming kind of compliments I get from students is that
Absolutely.
I'm not necessarily unbiased in class, but that I'm open, non-judgmental maybe.
You're trying to see the forest for the trees. You're trying to stand outside and be objective.
Right.
Rather than, I've noticed that about you big time. You know, I've noticed that somebody might be on a pretty liberal kick. You know, a lot of those classes tend to sway liberal.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And you would play the devil's advocate. Like,
I don't think I'd play devil's advocate. I don't know if
am I wording that wrong?
Yeah, I don't think I'd agree with that. But I
what were you doing then?
I try and play like data's advocate, right?
Good. Yeah.
I mean, I try and just say like, hey, here's the information. Like,
right.
You know, here's the thing that the argument you're making, or the thing you're saying in class, or the thing you're trying to put out there. Like, you can have whatever values you want, but you can't
refute that.
But you can't base them on something that's not true.
Right.
That's it.
Right.
Hey, you know what was a good example of a universalist movement recently and was successful?
Give it to me.
Same-sex marriage movement.
Okay.
It was totally framed in universalist terms and not identitarian terms. So here's an important thing to note, right? Identitarianism is not the only route towards helping out marginalized groups, and universalism doesn't mean ignoring the differences between us. So same-sex marriage starts as a movement, and it has at its foundation a value, and the value was let's allow everyone to be married, or marriage is a social and societal benefit both to the individual and to the society more broadly when people can engage in that. Hey, and guess what? There's some folks that aren't allowed to take part in that institution. And so it's like a classic. It's like the MLK civil rights movement of the 60s. It's a classic universalist movement.
Right.
So it's not that they've entirely gone away from, you know, kind of where things are at today. It's that within online and social media spaces and voices that get amplified a lot on Twitter and places like that, it's gone away.
Wow, that's interesting. So you're saying this is a great insight into universalism and identitarianism. What I'm understanding is that the liberal side is using the identitarianism more.
Maybe depending on how you're using the word.
using it against.
Depending on how you're using the word liberal, but maybe.
Right.
I mean,
right.
so
I should say left.
Yeah. Well, no, I don't know. I maybe not. The left, I think, is less identitarian, and the liberals are more so. So you see it a lot in the Democratic Party these days. I mean, okay, let me, and you know, I don't know who I'm going to alienate in saying this, but here's a pretty concrete example going back to the 2016 primaries and election cycle and all that. Candidate Hillary Clinton, right, was really embraced. I mean, this was right at kind of the peak time for this kind of identitarian kind of woke movement to be moving into the big institutions in our society. And the Clinton campaign really embraced that. They or attempted to. Right. They tried to use kind of that language. They made sure that they had this like sort of representation in their staff. They tried to use the language of identitarianism to say like, you know, to sort of use all the right words to demonstrate that they were on board with, you know, with Me Too and with Black Lives Matter and all these kinds of things, right? But this is also the Hillary Clinton campaign the same Hillary Clinton that had supported the crime bill, that had supported welfare reform, that had supported, you know, every war of bombing brown people that has happened in my lifetime.
Absolutely.
And so, like, how do you square those things? How do you reconcile those things? And it's because, remember, that identitarianism is not inconsistent with neoliberalism.
Right.
Because, like,
okay, now I'm drawing the connection.
As long as we can get, you know, sort of demographic representation and equity in the representation of oppressive systems, whether they're like war or poverty or whatever, then like then we're okay. It's sort of the underlying argument there, even if that's not said explicitly. So it's identitarianism coming into politics, and of course now like that's all it is. Yeah. Right. You had, I think, in the 2016 campaign, you had the Sanders campaign really running a more traditional, like, universalist leftist campaign. They looked a lot more like MLK, and that changed a little bit by 2020. The Sanders campaign also became more identitarian, I think, by 2020.
To try to win,
right? Because it you know it saw which way the wind was blowing and kind of where society is at right now. Right. So you know we've got.
Well, and he had to backlash the demonization of the word socialism. You know what I mean? He had to fight that.
Yeah. I mean, you tell me. We've got a society and a world right now where like we are increasingly like aware of and sensitive to the language that people use that signifies inequality, and yet environmentally The planet is in massive trouble.
Right.
Economically, we've got the biggest gap between the rich and the poor in history. Our homicide rate increased for the first time in American history, increased by 30% last year.
I was going to ask you that because it's gone down every year.
For 30 years or 25 years or something before that.
Absolutely.
And now all of a sudden jumps up by 30% in 1 year. So you check this out, right? So if you look at the rest of the data,
what attributes to that?
So homicides are up 30%. If you look at all the crime data in the FBI UCR report this year, right? Homicides are up 30%. Almost everything else is down with two exceptions. Assaults are also up, and auto thefts are up. Oh, and sorry, one more, and arson is up. Okay. But so like burglary and robbery, those are down. At least reports of sexual assault, thank goodness, are down.
Yeah.
But homicide, assault, arson, auto theft, all up. So I teach criminology classes too, and in criminology we say that assault and homicide track each other. So it makes sense if one's up, the other is up, right? Because a homicide is a successful assault,
right?
Or an assault is a not very good homicide,
exactly.
However you want to think of it. So why are those kinds of things up? But the typical economic things, you'd think, everybody lost their jobs this last year. A lot of people did. And there's been a lot of, economic turmoil associated with the pandemic. So there's an kind of an old fashioned explanation that would say,
disillusion?
Well, yeah, you'd expect like burglaries to go up and like bank robberies to go up. Nope. That stuff all kind of kept going down like it had been. Poverty doesn't cause crime, not directly.
Right.
People don't steal things because they're poor.
Right. Right.
What you did have, I think, a lot this last year is like kind of wild crime, killing somebody out of anger, assaulting somebody out of anger, stealing a car because what the hell? I'm going to go steal a car.
Right.
Burning something. Those arsons that were increased, those aren't, at least, and I'm going to say this, I think, that on a preliminary look at the data, those aren't people burning their warehouse down for the insurance money arsons.
Right.
Those are like, I want to see the pretty flames and watch it all burn kind of arsons.
Right.
So you've got what it looks to me like a sort of wave of crime of people that are psychologically and emotionally just like
exactly
off the hook.
They're exasperated. They're just done.
And that's a pandemic, but I think it's also like, again, it's social media and it's massive inequality and it's kind of where our society's at right now. It's what a crumbling empire looks like. The people in the empire are falling apart.
That's the proof is in that statistic.
Yeah.
Really. I mean, it makes total sense that they're just reaching a breaking point and disillusioned with the whole thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And when you find out the American dream isn't real, and we've known that, but what were you going to say?
Go on.
No. I mean, it just that blows me away because crime has always went down in every aspect, and then all of a sudden that tells me that we're definitely in a civil war. You know what I mean?
Something's wrong. Yeah. When things get really bad in a society, there's like these three historical routes that cultures take to get themselves out of a massive mess, right? And by massive mess, I mean when you've got massive inequality, when you've got potentially wars, when you've got people at polarization and people at each other's throats. Sometimes people respond to that, or societies respond to that by scapegoating. Let's call that the Nazi Germany option, right?
Gotcha.
Where people go, hey, my life's pretty sucky right now, and so I'm going to blame it on Jews, or I'm going to blame it on, immigrants, or I'm going to blame it on Roma, or I'm going to blame it on women or gay people or something like that.
Right.
So that's one kind of way that societies respond to a mess.
It's your fault.
Right.
Yeah.
And usually that's kind of pointing down. Like,
right.
Look at these outsiders.
Right.
The focus against immigrants right now is the classic textbook example of exactly that.
Yeah.
The society screwed up. People lose their job and they go, oh, it must be the fault of some guy who moved here from Mexico.
Pass me that salad.
Right. Second option for how societies respond is they see that big mess and they go, you know what? This must be the fault of the elites. Let's call this the French Revolution, where people go, you know who's doing this? It's the people at the top. It's the wealthiest of the wealthy that are kind of imposing this on the rest of us, and there could be some truth in that, but at the same time, it tends to be kind of radical in its approach, and it tends to be it doesn't always end up in the best way, right? The French Revolution led to Napoleon.
Right.
and the terror and the Great Terror. And a bunch of people died, and they didn't end up with a democracy really until after World War II.
Right.
So there's, 100 and something years of messed up society as a result
people died.
in the wake of the French Revolution. Option 3, what we did in the U.S. in the 1930s, you had the Great Depression, and we had, the reform approach, the FDR kind of approach there, where we said, like, okay, within the boundaries of our society, how can we reform this to, to soften the worst edges of capitalism and to kind of make this work,
right?
And keep the train on the rails, and it led to the most growth and the most production and the most wealth, and I would argue the most the biggest gains in equality internally.
You couldn't present the New Deal now. There's no way
in human history.
Yeah.
And so
it'd be socialist, communism now if you tried to,
So we've got, the United States is at this point right now where we've got all the mess, and we've got a faction of our society, call them the Trumpists, that are basically the Nazis. They're basically saying, let's scapegoat the immigrants and let's scapegoat the outsiders and the marginalized and stuff, and let's say that's where our problems are coming from.
Yeah.
You've got another faction of society that's a little bit the French Revolution, but isn't necessarily pulling it off too well, but kind of the French Revolution. And I think that this is kind of the identitarian approach that we were talking about earlier. Right. And you've got a little bit of a society that's saying, we need some sort of reform. Here's how we can kind of fix these things. I think that we've lost a little bit of that in the last couple of years as we become more polarized and more of sort of a war. There's less of that kind of FDR approach. But, those are basically all the options that a society has. Like, there's not other things that we know of historically that societies do when they're in the middle of a mess. Like, they scapegoat, they, revolt, or they reform, and those are kind of our options,
right? Those are the only options. And how do you see us coming out of it with one of those options? What one are we going to follow, you think?
Yeah, I think if you'd asked me that 5 or 6 years ago, or 10 years ago, I would have said, the U.S. is stable and reform will be the obvious place that we'll go.
Right.
But that was 10 years ago. That was before the massive growth of the scapegoating movement, which I didn't necessarily
see coming.
There were bits and pieces of it, but nothing like on the level that we've seen it. That for sure threw me off. And I didn't see just how lack of institutionally organized the left would be. That there would be so much circular firing squad, so much fighting with itself, so much divisiveness.
Very fragmented
and very finger pointy,
Yeah.
Lots of use of shame. That always works well.
Right. And shaming each other, and you use this word wrong and you're standing for this wrong, and this internal, rather than getting together and trying to find a common goal and get it figured out.
Right.
You know what I mean?
They're fighting amongst themselves.
Before
they can even
at least the Trumpsters have a common goal.
Right.
You know what I mean?
They're the best one, but a common
not the best one, but it's a common goal.
Well, and they've got organizations and institutions and stuff. I mean, what does the left have right now that compares with the church or the Republican Party or,
right.
I mean, it doesn't exist. If you look at the successful leftist movements in human history, they had institutions and the tiny bit we've got are the dregs of labor unions, but most of those are public sector at this point, which is
ACLU,
not even really the same thing. Yeah. I mean,
yeah, that's interesting. Well, we have went way over.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's not your fault.
Oh my God, it's 7:30.
Yeah, I can go ARC. I can go forever. With you. So, you got to come back. Have I pissed you off so you won't come back?
No, I think I'm not pissed off. I mean, as long as you keep the water coming and you've got Zots, so
I got plenty.
He just noticed the Zots.
No, he was on it right away.
Really?
Right away. He goes,
my favorite candy. Yeah.
Are they really?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we
and I explained to him the turmoil that I had with the Zot people, and how they want to vilify me and try to support their product.
Exactly, and we've said to so many people, look, we have Zots, and they're like, what's that? Zots was a big deal. When I was a kid.
Me too. Yeah.
Zots and Mario. Anyways, so my question to you is, so I say this at the end of all of our podcasts, and this is really reductionist for a guy like you. Okay, you're gonna. I think I don't know how you'll kick it out, but I'm still gonna ask you. It's reductionist though in a way. I think you're gonna find it a little difficult. So, by the way, we got a good education on universalism and identitarianism, right? Did I say that right?
I think so.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't expect to get that.
And not everybody's using these terms yet.
I just think it's
great.
great.
That's me grabbing at terms to try and describe concepts that
I love it.
And
I want to get into your book next time, and I want to get into, your thoughts on globalization, because I don't think people really understand it in any way, globalization and the dependency on since Reagan and what we've done. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I need to read your stuff before we talk about it.
Okay. Yeah, we can do that.
But here's my main question, okay? Not my main question, but the closing question. If you could say one thing, have everybody's attention in the world, and you could say one or two sentences, and everybody turned to you and said, David, talk to us, what would you say? Right?
Dun, dun, dun.
Wow.
Na, 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 na.
That's high stress. I like to be smart and I like to be strategic.
I know.
So here we go.
Okay.
I'd have to think about it.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'd have to put it together, and I'd have to come back with it because
I didn't expect anything less from you.
There's not a one right answer kind of thing.
Right.
I mean, I even wonder when I go back and listen to this afterwards if I'm going to say, "Oh, did I really say that? Was that really quite how I meant that?" I mean, I think it's important to be precise in our language and our words, and I don't have a one precise thing that would sum up what humans have or need.
It's pretty
or
hard.
Like that.
It's pretty hard to do.
Right. I want them to be smart. I want them to be historical. I want them to be informed. I want them to be reasonable. I want people to be generous. I like that.
You like that?
I like it when people are generous with the conversations they're having with people. Don't assume the worst of the person you're talking to. Assume the best of them.
Right. And that's a real issue these days. I'm trying not to be around people that see the glass half empty. It's tough to create open discourse in that way. So what I'm thinking is I asked you a question that is going to make you come back.
Oh, there we go. Perfect. I love it. Okay, I'll have to. What would be my message to the world?
Yeah. Exactly.
Right.
So it's all about you.
Okay.
Your message to the world.
My message to the world. Right.
Individualism, right?
Ugh.
So, okay, David, we had a great time, man. I can't thank you enough, but I would definitely want to have you back and, kick a bunch of ideas off you, because you're just a wealth of knowledge, and we need more people like you in the world. So I appreciate it very much.
Thanks for having me, folks.
So Eric Scott talks a lot here. Random and Reckless Entertainment brings us this awesome show, Brainstar Media. Be a brain star, use your brain. Thank you, David. I appreciate you very much. All right. Take care.
See ya.
Yep.